Hello everyone, Mike Rempel from Another Set of Eyes with today's Excel Bytes blog post. Today we're going to take a look at using a bunch of functions to create a horizontal list from a long vertical list, pulling out a section of it based on a specific entry we make. Sounds confusing? Probably is, but let's take a look at what happens here. Here's our challenge. We have a list of states here. Could be a list of anything. I have our 50 states in alphabetical order. And what I want to do is be able to type in any state name here and produce the next 10 in the row in this list. So whatever state I type here, I'm going to get the next 10 of the list in here. So if I type in Alabama, it's going to give me from Alaska to Hawaii. If I type in Ohio, it will give me Oklahoma to Vermont. Utah will give me Vermont to Wyoming, and then there's no states beyond that. If I type in an error, it's going to just give me blanks. So to accomplish that, we're using these 5 functions: if error, offset, indirect, match, and the columns function. The only point of the if error function is to wrap our offset function and its intricacies in it so that if there is an error, it'll just generate a blank. The offset, indirect, match, and columns are really what's doing all the heavy lifting here. So if we look at if error, all if error does is return the value if error if the expression is an error, and the value of the expression itself otherwise. Very basically, it's you have an expression. If it's an error, you say what you want it to be. If it's not an error, it'll just give you the results of that expression. And the syntax of that is the value or the expression, and then if that's an error, what do you want it to do? In our case, we have this long function or formula with offset, indirect, match, and columns as our value, and then if it's an error, we just have double blanks, so it just gives us a blank. So that's all if error is in our formula here. The offset function returns a reference to a range that is the given number of rows or columns from a reference. So the syntax is offset, the reference, whatever that is, and then how many rows down, how many columns over from that anchor point or that reference do we want to go. In our case, with our list of states, we'll always want to go so many rows down, but no columns over. So if you take a look in our formula here, the last 0, and we'll talk about this, the last function here at the offset is always going to be a 0 because we're going 0 columns over. And that's the case with all our formulas in this long list. Indirect. What the indirect function does is returns a reference specified by a text string. So if you build a text string that actually that looks like a cell reference, the indirect function will take that and actually convert it to that cell reference. And in this case, the syntax is just the reference text. And looks like I have a little correction I need to make there. I didn't want a curly bracket, I just wanted a square bracket. I didn't like that, did it? Okay, so we're going to need to put that in front of it. Okay, so that fixed that. So it's just, that's an optional thing if you want to use the A1 syntax, or if you want to use the R1C1 for row column syntax. So that's optional. It defaults to the A1 style, and that's what we're using here. The match function returns the relative position of an item in an array that matches a specific value. So with match, you have a lookup value, you give it your array, and then what's your match type. In our case, we're using 0, which indicates an exact match type. So the lookup value is going to be whatever is in this cell that we type. The array is going to be our list of states, and then the match type is exact. And that's going to give us the position of that, whatever we type here within that list or within that array. And the columns function, it just returns the number of columns in an array or reference, and it's just columns array. So what we're using columns for is to count the number of rows down we need to go from our entry. So for example, with our entry being here, if we want to know the number of columns from column B to column B, that's 1. So that'll tell us from here we'll want to go down 1 in our list of states. If I'm over here, that's 2 columns over, or 2 columns for B and C. So from here I'll want to go 2 rows down to return the result there. So that's how we're using the columns function. So let's take a look at our formula here. Again, if error just wraps it up, so we don't have an error if we type something wrong or if this is blank. So we're going to start looking at the indirect function. Now in the indirect function, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy that, and that should be from there to there. I hit Control C, enter, and I'm going to just do a Control V. So there's our indirect function. I'm going to go ahead and enter a state here so we can see exactly what it's going to do. So what's the indirect function doing? I'm going to take that off of there, put an equal sign, and it's going to give us Utah. It's telling us whatever I have there, that's my reference or my anchor point for my offset function. So what we're doing with indirect, you can see I have in quotes states exclamation point $A $. So I have in quotes states exclamation point $A $. So that's the beginning of what the position that we want, or that cell reference. So again, if we're looking at that, and I want to concatenate that, that's the ampersand there. I want to concatenate that with the match function. And what is the match function doing? Let's take a look at that. I'm going to highlight the match function, Control C, enter, come down here, do an equals, Control V, in this case 44. Okay, so I want to concatenate whatever, or this phrase states a something with 44. So if I do equals states 44, I'm going to get Utah, because on our list of states in row 44 is Utah. So again, that's what the indirect function is doing. It's concatenating the states $A $, with using the ampersand with whatever the match returns. And the match is looking for this on that list of states and giving the position of that, in this case the 44th one, and that's what's telling us Utah, because Utah is the 44th item on that list. So that's how we are using the indirect and match functions here. Again, the column function is just counting our number of columns that we're including here. So notice I have columns A1 in an absolute cell reference to A1 in a relative cell reference. So every time so that means A1 to A1 is going to be a 1. Here I have A1 to B1, that's 2 columns, so that's going to give me a 2. If I highlight that and hit F9, I get a 2. So in this spot on the offset function, the indirect and match, that whole group there, if we look at the offset syntax, that's strictly the first point or the reference. The columns function is the next section, or the rows. So by identifying or using the columns function to go from A1, B1, that's going to give me a 2. That tells me how many rows down I want to go from Utah to get to Virginia, in that case 2. The 0 here is telling me how many columns over I want to go. Since our list of states is only a single column, I don't want to go any columns over to the right, so that's why we've defined that as 0. So again, offset is using indirect and match to determine the reference point, or our stake in the ground. The columns function is telling us how many rows down we want to go by counting the number of columns over from our our stake in the ground point, cell A2, and the 0 is telling us how many columns over I want to go in our list, and that's always going to be 0. So using these 5 functions, if, error, offset, indirect, match, and columns, we are able to enter any one on our list here, and it'll give us the next 10 going across. And there you have it. Quite complex, but I think we were able to get through it pretty easily. I hope you liked it. I hope you find it useful somewhere in your business or daily life. If you'd like to see more, please feel free to go to my website, excel-bytes.com, and I hope you subscribe. Happy excelling.